Gail, I'm probably the only person living that knows what I'm about to relate to you concerning some facts that I know that took place back in the mid-30s. It is a well-known fact that J Frank Norris and John R. Rice were good friends. But there came a time in about 1935 that friction began to develop between the two. And it was all based upon the question of practices that John R. Rice was engaged in when he would accompany Dr. Norris to meetings in various towns surrounding the Fort Worth area. Like, for instance, Jacksboro, Bonham, Sherman, Paris, Waxahachie. Through the 20s, and even before, Dr. Norris could draw great crowds in these cities. John R. Rice would follow up and preach each night, holding the crowd together, and then eventually, in most cases, a church would be organized, and many of them are still in existence today. Now, the background between the trouble that emerged between J. Frank Norris and John R. Rice had to do with the fact that John R. Rice had begun to show tinges of what we might call the elements of Pentecostalism. Namely, in this case, the fact that he would call forward people to be anointed with oil, and he would pray for them, much like it's taught in the charismatic or the Pentecostal churches. And this type of practices was anathema as far as J. Frank Norris is concerned. And so the argument between the two began over the fact of J. Frank Norris, or rather John R. Rice, engaging in activities that J. Frank Norris simply disagreed with. And so it finally culminated in Paris, Texas, where I was living at that time. And there was a fellowship meeting there. I was 15 years old. And my mother took me out of school purposely to hear all of these great preachers. Namely, among them was J. Frank Norris and John R. Rice. And it so happened that at this particular meeting in January of 1935, the culminating confrontation between these two strong characters came to fruition. And I remember specifically John R. Rice when he came to the platform to deliver his message. And in fact, he did not deliver a message, but he immediately engaged in a tirade against Dr. Norris, saying what a vicious man that he was, and that he deserved to be put in his place. And I don't like the way he has treated me, and so on and so forth. And he on and on and on, instead of engaging in presenting a true gospel message. His whole message for at least 15 minutes was directed toward trying to put it in a colloquialism, badmouth J. Frank Norris. And at that time, my mother rose to her feet, and she was the kind of a person that when she heard something that was out of place, she had the courage to rise up whether she was right or wrong. I'm not debating that question, but I am relating to you the actual facts. My mother got up and walked to the front of that church building, pointed her finger at J. Frank, or rather, now listen, let me correct it, pointed her finger at John R. Rice. Dr. Rice, we did not invite you to come here to castigate J. Frank Norris. And if you cannot do any better than that, I, as a member of this church, am asking you to leave this building immediately. And so she sat down. John R. Rice responded with tears. And I'm not trying to be facetious or unkind to John R. Rice, but then he broke into tears. Well, lady, I'm sorry if I offended you. I'm sorry. And so then he stopped his tirade against J Frank Norris and began to preach. And as well as I remember, preached a noteworthy sermon. Then, say an hour or so later, it became Dr. Norris's time to come to the pulpit. And there was never a sermon preached anywhere that caused the response from a congregation any more than the sermon that he preached that day, without referring one iota about the speech that J. Frank or that Ron R. Rice had made. And he preached a sermon that moved that whole congregation to tears. And after the meeting, after the say lunchtime or whenever the meeting broke up, and the crowd began to mingle around, I remember seeing Dr. Norris motion with his finger and said, "Lady, come over here." And his immediate response to her was, and I was with my mother and I heard this, he said, "Lady, I admire your courage." And he says, "You're the kind of person that helped me build the First Baptist Church. I'd like to have you as a member of my church." And to make a long story short, 6 months later, we moved to Fort Worth and we became a member of the First Baptist Church. But this is an experience that I saw with my own eyes, and I speak of an absolute surety, even though I couldn't back it up by any documented evidence. What I'm saying to you in this video, Gail, is the absolute truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Daddy.